Okay, so welcome to Eat, Move, Think, the show about optimal wellness brought to you by Medcan.
Wow. Do it again.
Oh, I was practicing. Okay, ready?
Welcome to Eat, Move, Think,
the show about
optimal
wellness brought to you by Medcan.
Yeah, this is extremely good. Thank you.
Data or data? Data or data?
It's a good way to get into it. How do you say it?
I think I'd flip-flop.
We should do a poll.
Eat, Move, Think listeners, this is a survey. Maybe we'll put a link on the website.
I think we should put a link and then we can discuss it in the next episode.
So health and wellness. For years, the big source of data collection was the annual medical. And this was one day and you got your vital signs, you got all of that stuff. You might be there for a couple of hours and 5 hours and create all this data. And then the MD analyzes it and makes some sort of declaration about your health. And if you're in the field of optimal wellness, what has you salivating is the idea that you could track data all the time, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, 7 days a week.
Yeah.
Making your assessment of somebody's wellness based on this all the time data. And that data is happening. We're creating that data with wearables.
Whatever we have on our wrists, those smart watches, Apple Watch, Fitbit, what else?
Oura Ring.
Oura Ring, yeah.
Whoop Band.
Whoop Band is my favorite name for one. I gotta get one.
I'm Chris.
I'm Jasmine.
We're the producers of Eat, Move, Think. And today we're talking about wearables and wellness. We are approaching a waypoint in the way we manage our optimal wellness, where it is going to be based on this near infinite amount of data that is being created by wearables. And to do something with that data, a Silicon Valley company called Evidation is creating an enormous pool of the information from those wearables with the idea that it's going to be useful, say to pharmaceutical companies seeking to make better medical therapies.
But also to medical researchers that are seeking to help those MDs that are doing your annual medical to make earlier diagnoses of some serious health problems. So to get a sense of just what all that wearable data can mean for our wellness today and in the future, in the latest episode of Eat, Move, Think, we have Medcan's Clinical and Product Director of Sports Medicine, Therapy, Rehabilitation, and Fitness, Dr. Andrew Miners, and he'll be talking today with Evidation's Chief Operating Officer, Leslie Wilberforce.
If you've ever had the sense that device you wear on your wrist could be used for more than just tracking your steps, this is the episode for you.
Really exciting. Let's get to it.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, Eat, Move, Think listeners. I'm Dr. Andrew Miners, the Move host of Eat, Move, Think. We've got a great show for you here today. I've got Leslie Wilberforce here, and now she's the Chief Operating Officer of a company called Evidation Health, which is based in Silicon Valley, California. It's a startup that has pioneered the use of personally generated health data. Now, what we mean by personally generated health data is data that's generated by people, individuals using wearable technology. And they use this data to optimize human wellness through an app they call Evidation Reward Health. Now, she's going to be guiding us through the many ways that wearable data is being used to help us both live longer, healthier lives and also get more out of our life. So welcome, Leslie. Thank you for joining us today.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here.
I think it's great because so many people use wearables these days. I use a Fitbit, and people are always asking all about it. Like, how accurate is it? What's the information? What's it used for? And that's what you do. So maybe we can start off with a quick explanation of what Evidation is and what your company does.
Yeah, awesome. So at Evidation, what we are really excited about doing is creating new ways to measure and activate people around their health in their everyday lives. So, if you zoom back a number of years, we were really founded around this idea that the richest data that exists about someone's health is really invisible to the healthcare system, but it really disproportionately matters in terms of understanding the presence and progression of disease and engaging around your wellness and a number of these things. So like you said, we work a lot with what we call PGHD, person-generated healthcare data, which like you said, is really just a novel way of generating data from individuals themselves in their own environment often what we think of there is wearable data are a big component of that. But another big thing is it can also include sort of self-reported information. If you have a connection with individuals, that can really help to contextualize some of that information as well. So that's a little bit about what we do. And what we are able to use that data for is to really think about how to understand health in a different way. We can generate novel insights from that data and really make individualized recommendations to help people see how they're doing in everyday life. So at Evidation, really, we have this technology that allows us to do that. And then what we do with it is we have a large consumer population in the US, around 5 million people participating.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
Yeah. And through that, people can get recommendations for how to get healthier themselves, but they also have opportunities to participate in research where these novel types of data can be used in that type of context or research context to understand health differently. So that's a little bit about what we do.
That's cool. So it's not just about wearable data, it's also about interactive data. So people that are engaged with your application, you might be asking them questions about what they're doing or what they're feeling or things like that. And so it's not just for the benefit of the people engaging in your app or the wearable that they're using. It's also about trying to help the population as a whole, like your 5 million users, for example.
Yes, absolutely. It definitely has this dual benefit of like win-win, like be able to sort of like learn about your health, but also you have the opportunity to contribute to something greater.
Oh, wow.
I think the other really cool thing about being here is it's kind of democratized who's been able to participate in research.
Mm-hmm.
People can participate then from anywhere with real life data.
Not just the 20-year-olds that are in university.
Yeah, exactly. And when you ask people, it's really interesting. Have you ever participated in a research study? Most people say no. And the number one reason why is nobody ever asked me.
Yeah.
So it's really a great opportunity to kind of bring some of those things together.
Oh, that's fantastic. Now, because we talk about wearable, I mentioned Fitbit, but there's many different things out there. And we think back, probably one of the earliest wearables we think about were Garmin run trackers, that will tell you how far you ran and maybe how fast you are. But now there's so many out there in the market. And my understanding is that Evidation, and I must say for our listeners that Evidation's in the United States right now. It's not available in Canada. But Evidation is an agnostic platform, meaning it's not linked to one single wearable.
Exactly. So one of our goals early on was to kind of meet people where they are in their healthcare journey. And part of that is like letting people connect the wearables or apps that they use to track their health that they're frankly most used to using and most comfortable using in their daily lives. So, the premise is people can join, they can connect whatever they're using, which ranges from everything like you said, a Fitbit, a Garmin, an Apple Watch, to more medical grade devices like a Dexcom glucose meter, for example. So that's kind of how we built some of the technology ingest layers to really allow a broad swath of things that people have in their daily lives to be used.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned 5 million people are part of your application. What do you think the users, how many users are there out there, you think, in the United States that are using some kind of wearable or trackable health data device? Do you think it's double that? What do you think it is?
Yeah, there's some really good Pew research out from a few years ago that shows that, over time, about 1 in 5 Americans has a wearable or fitness tracker. I'm guessing even since the publication of that number has probably continued to climb. I think one really interesting piece here too is that's been definitely a wave over the last 10 years is that the ubiquity of smartphones has really made a big difference here too. Mm-hmm. So even if you don't have a wearable, there's starting to be more and more ways that people's smartphones are sophisticated enough with things like accelerometers, things built into the operating system to capture stuff like steps.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at smartphone penetration, that's 85% plus and is a nice thing that cuts across a lot of demographic, socioeconomic type factors as well. So I think that's an important thing to be mentioned there too.
Very good point, which kind of makes me think of a couple more questions sort of linking on that. So, one of the things we hear in the media, it's all about our data.
Yeah.
Variable pricing based on your interest levels or how many times you visit a website or something like that. On the benefits of this data, how would this data that you might be collecting benefit an individual, say me as a single user, versus, you mentioned research. So how would it, and can you give us some examples of how it might benefit, the larger population and how that data might be used in a positive way?
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly from an individual perspective, ways to learn about sort of your health and wellness, ability to set goals and challenges, and really just, we've seen really impactful data across a lot of our programs around just increasing activity levels as a really sort of individualized example. We're also starting to do more with people being able to opt into programs really transparently, and based on the data we see from users, be able to share insights back with them, prompt them when they may want to go have a conversation with their physician, as an example too. We've done some stuff around heart health as an example in that realm. In terms of how some of the examples of where the data is used to help everyone, one great example is over a number of years, users have contributed data, again, in a consented fashion to help us understand, can we see signs of infectious illness, think flu, think COVID, which is really relevant in these days.
Yeah.
Can we use that to develop sort of machine learning models to see an early sign of onset of symptoms earlier? And it turns out from years of research, we've been able to do that and are now able to deploy large level programs where people opt in. We are able to passively monitor some of their wearable data and see really early when, it looks like there's been a change in some of your step or sleep patterns, and be able to prompt people to say, hey, are you feeling anything different? And based on what they answer, if it looks like they have early symptoms of flu or COVID, we can prompt them into, for example, a research study, or say, hey, you might want to think about whether you go into school or the office today, to think about how to reduce spread of transmission on others, which is really where this intersection of sort of building on the research to sort of public health use cases, I think, becomes really, really interesting.
Amazing. And so let's say someone who has a heart condition, that they might be able to opt in to have specific data that's tracked, that you might say, hey, you might want to get checked out. Is that kind of the idea? Or, hey, heads up, something's changed in your body metrics, the things we're looking at. Be aware of this. Yep.
Or you might want to go have a conversation with your physician based on some of those changes. So, for example, we deployed a program and thousands of users on our platform that they opted into around heart health, and especially looking at exacerbation of things like COPD.
Okay.
And we're able to provide, for example, passive monitoring and a report back to someone to say, hey, it might be a time to have a conversation with your physician. Here's a report on some important things that we developed in concert with specialists that felt really relevant to the condition, and helps really enable that conversation to happen in a much richer way.
That's wow. And just for our listeners, COPD is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So it's a disease of your respiratory system. That's really fascinating, because it's almost getting to the point where your doctor's calling you instead of you calling your doctor. Because if this, and we're probably not there yet, but sounds like that's where your company is going with this. So people opt into this, right? It's not Big Brother-ish. They're not, someone's not following around looking over your shoulder the whole time. These are things that you've opted into, which before I get to that, but that's really cool, where you're looking at being proactive in your health, early detection, prompting people to make earlier interventions in their health or earlier investigations in their health that might have a significant impact on the long-term ramifications of health behaviors or ill health, I guess.
Yeah, and I think at scale, you start having these interesting things where you can really start shifting from reactive care, which is, a lot of what the history of healthcare has been, to more proactive care.
Yeah. And
like you said, you can kind of get to a place where the doctor calls you. I think that's really, really powerful. And I think we're kind of coming out of this phase where there's been a lot of research looking at hey, how can we measure things? How can we develop different, what we would call digital biomarkers to understand something about the presence of progression of disease? I think the next phase of this is starting to be, how can we use those to affect the decisions people make about their health, or to hook people into the healthcare system in a really different way?
You mentioned COPD. Is there any other conditions that you've looked at using the collection of wearable data for extrapolation to population-based health research?
Yeah, an example of a program that we've worked on with Apple and Johnson & Johnson is called the Heartline Study. And it's a study that's looking to see as a primary aim if we can diagnose atrial fibrillation, which is a type of cardiac arrhythmia. So when your heart beats wrong, much earlier in adults over 65. And gosh, if you can do that over time, can you prevent some of the more feared complications, debilitating complications like a stroke, for example, in that population? And so that's a great example of using a wearable like an Apple Watch, a sensor, and an engagement program delivered through an app to try and further outcomes and really understand that condition much better.
Wow. So almost early detection of something like atrial fibrillation.
Yeah, exactly. Looking at, can you detect it much earlier in a large scale population, which, going back to one of your earlier points, has significant impact on an individual's life,
For
but
sure.
it also has significant understanding on just how you manage that condition in a population.
And potentially impact on the healthcare system too, because if you get diseases, especially chronic non-communicable type disease that has a large burden on the healthcare system when it gets to the end stage in terms of resources and time, it has an impact on the overall healthcare system as well, making it early detection is always better for many, many reasons.
Early detection is always better. Exactly. And so there's a number of conditions that we've worked in along that vein. Cardiac arrhythmias is a great one. Like you said, if you can detect it early and avoid stroke, gosh, that is impactful for so many reasons for a user, but also for costs on the healthcare system. Absolutely. We've done work, for example, in cognitive decline, which is a great example as well.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So we've looked at patients with Alzheimer's disease and other cognitive related sort of neurodegenerative stuff. And what we've been really interested in is, can you use things, for example, we just have some new research out with Boston University, can you use things like voice recordings and paralinguistic features? What I mean by that is things like speaking time, types of words people use, different pauses in speech as a potential diagnostic tool to see Alzheimer's much earlier than when someone goes to the physician and says, hey, I'm really having trouble remembering people's names or remembering where I put my keys. And the thing that's really impactful here, right, in that vein of being able to see conditions early is there's therapies and things that can be done, and they work better if you can find people at the early onset of disease. And so that's another great example where we're looking for what we call digital biomarkers to kind of find those early signals much sooner than you might otherwise.
That's really fascinating. Using an indirect measure of speech or word selection to get an early indicator of cognitive decline. That's really interesting because that's one of the things you see if anybody has a loved one or been around folks that do have cognitive decline. It is the missing words or pausing or word selection that you do notice these things when you're acting with a loved one or an elderly person that might be experiencing cognitive decline. That's really cool.
Absolutely. And the whole idea is, hey, through machine learning, can you actually tune that to happen even earlier than when a caregiver or a loved one might start noticing that in someone? And gosh, is that window of time earlier important? And, thinking about how to manage that condition going forward.
That's really amazing stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on around here. There's also a lot of really interesting research going on in things like rheumatoid arthritis or other types of flare conditions.
So things that get better and worse intermittently, like
things that get better and worse intermittently. So great examples are rheumatoid arthritis, things like migraines, where actually through sort of movement patterns, sleep, you can start seeing signals of flares early. And there are other great examples of ones where, hey, if you intervene early, you can start doing things that actually maybe reduce the severity of that flare or help you manage the condition better over time.
That's really cool because I'm as a musculoskeletal person, I see a lot of people with aches and pains, sprains and strains and arthritic changes. And we know that exercise is medicine for a lot of arthritic conditions, hip and knee pain, for example, the right exercise in the right way and the right dosage. And it's usually a balancing act between too little, which is no good, and too much, which is no good. And so I see, the opportunity there for wearable data to sort of help coach someone on, hey, you're not moving enough, or hey, take it easy. The last time you moved this much, you're really sore the next day. Maybe you need to take a break. Like as a way to manage these chronic degenerative conditions, prevention's a big word, but more management is probably very much within a realistic expectation of a goal.
I think you're absolutely right. And it kind of goes back to this notion that, gosh, you can't change what you can't measure.
Right.
So if you can start measuring it, and I think in the use case you provided there, my guess is it's probably really individual, sort of what that sweet spot of sort of exercise or mobility may be per person. So, over time, can you build feedback loops with someone's self-reported data? Hey, how am I feeling? And match that up with temporally, hey, what have I been doing? How have I been sleeping? How much have I been moving around? And really kind of build these feedback loops that, again, on a very personalized, individualized basis, can kind of help to keep people and help manage their condition and provide recommendations about where that sweet spot actually might be for them.
So Leslie, do you think this data can actually have an impact on personal behavior?
Yeah, and we see that in the data every day that we have at Evidation. There's example programs where we see wearables plus engagement around wellness can increase daily exercise minutes by about 40% in folks before they join certain programs.
Really? That's a lot.
Yeah. And if you look at different low activity groups, sometimes that can be as high as an 80% increase in daily exercise minutes. So when you really think about it, I think PGHD can just give you this rich understanding of social and structural determinants of health, like what's going on in the everyday life around health. And if you think about some of those things, 60-80% in the literature of modifiable risk factors that lead to adverse health outcomes really have to do with some of this everyday life type stuff. And that's really where I think wearables and some of this real life data can play a role.
That's really important because, as you say, non-communicable chronic disease like heart attack and stroke, obesity-related illness, diabetes, all of these things, it's all about lifestyle in most cases, frontline intervention. And if wearable data can help you, you're going to change lives and prevent deaths. That's really cool. It makes me think of a patient that I actually engaged with recently, actually. And I see a lot of different types of complex case, chronic pain patients, chronic fatigue patients, chronic pain and chronic fatigue. And these are complex multimodal conditions. It's not just about the fatigue. It's not just about the pain. There's other things going on, psychosocial overlay, mental health issues, all of these things going on. But in this one particular patient that I was chatting with, they had a wearable. And because of chronic fatigue, they've basically been bedridden for the last 3 months. You know, originally they were looking at 100 steps a day.
Wow.
Right? Like you get that almost going to the bathroom and back. So very much bedridden. And now I've just started to be engaged with this patient as part of a rehabilitation program, but now they're up to 1,000 steps a day, which again is not a lot of activity.
Wow.
And so he's using this as a barrier, meaning once I got a rest. And this patient's also monitoring heart rate with this wearable. Mm-hmm. And again, there's all kinds of issues with patients that you have to weed through and manage, but using heart rate up to 100 beats, and 100 beats means I'm going to have a bad day tomorrow. And 100 beats, normal heart rate for an adult male is 60 to 100 beats, right? So it's not that high.
Yep.
So in communicating with this patient, I'm getting this information and finding out some of the thought process behind their fear and their condition and the psychosocial overlay. But what I'm getting at is it sounds like if there was real data behind this, like tracking behavior and, like you said, using questionnaires or interactive symptom tracking, you might actually be able to break down some of the fear that people might have from, if I do more than 1,000 steps, I'm going to be in trouble. We could actually maybe disprove that, which would help people progress rehabilitation.
Yep.
Sorry, that was just a very long-winded anecdote about a patient where I see real-time use of this in an immediate healthcare setting.
Yeah, and I think too, it's a great sort of N of one example that we hear a lot of these stories too. But I think it really speaks to this fact of it's almost like that patient is sort of being their own self-regulation algorithm on it. But gosh, if you can figure out again how to contextualize their data with self-reported information, I think you can develop sort of motivation on one end in a way that doesn't push people too hard and meets people where they are and is kind of modulating with how they're doing, and also help people sort of protect the downside of too much, too fast, all of those twos, like you said before.
Yeah, rule of two is too much, too soon, too hard, too long, and sometimes too little rest and recovery in between.
And I think you brought up a good point too in that case is that there's all kinds of, different types of sensors, heart rate you mentioned in that case, which can be really linked to things like proxies for stress, proxies for, VO2 max in that case I could see being really impactful. And so some of the, newer sensor technology, I think you can see how that helps set a fuller picture of someone's progress too, and starts being a little bit more relatable to clinical outcomes that you might be more used to seeing in, within the walls of a clinic.
Yeah, interesting. I, as a wearable user, and being in healthcare, it's exciting to me to have that. Because as you said, this gets a glimpse into the data and information on a person's health that physicians typically wouldn't have access to. Because you think about a checkup, an annual checkup, it's a 30-minute or an hour consultation with your doctor and a few tests and maybe a few pictures of this and that, and you get a snapshot, one window in the year of that person's life. Whereas if we have a way to collect data that's longitudinal across that year, and you look at sleep patterns and respiratory rate and heart rate and blood pressure and all these things that now these wearable things are starting to track accurately, all of a sudden now your physician's watching you the whole year instead of just that momentary snapshot in time. And if we can make that data digestible to physicians, that sounds like they'd be really interested. I know I would be, to be really interested into getting that data to get a better, wholesome, widespread view of someone's activity and health as opposed to a snapshot.
Yeah, and I think you hit on two really important points there. One is sort of like the power of this longitudinal data. And I think one of the things that we really unlocked early is that the temporal nature of the data matters, and being able to kind of temporally line up all these different types of things that are happening in your life at a given time. And so in some ways, it's almost less about the exact accuracy of certain things, like, did I take 6,532 steps today or 7,012 steps today? But it's really about the patterns in that data and how they change over time, which can be really, really powerful. I think the second thing you hit on, which is feels like some of the next frontier, and there's a lot of work going on in the space, is how do you make that information digestible to the healthcare system? How do you actually like feed it in a way that is usable? Is it integrated with electronic health records? Those types of things, I think is some of the really interesting work that's starting to be done now.
That's fascinating. And that's where, at Medcan, we're hoping to do that. I know we're not there yet, but that's where we'd like to have that holistic view of someone's health moving forward. But I'm going to get into a really big topic, data privacy, right? Access to data. Like I said before, big brothering, everybody's watching what I'm doing. So people opt into this app and you're collecting this data, but what data are you collecting and how much say does a user have in how much data or what data you are collecting or how it's used?
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is an incredibly important question. And so I'm so glad that you asked it. At Evidation, we've always kind of had this notion that we have to be user privacy and transparency first in our mindset from the very, very beginning. So as a user, you have to have the option to consent in specific types of data, choose what you're consenting, know what you're consenting, know exactly how we're using it, over what time period, who's going to see it, and all of those things. And kind of the general principle is like, look, if people don't trust you to be a good steward of your step data, for example,
right? Gosh,
you'll never trust us to be a good steward of more sensitive data, like your electronic health record, your claims data, which people have patient-mediated ways to consent that in. And I think that's the really important part is like, how do you think about patient-mediated? The patient has and is central to the control of that data and central to how it's used, I think is incredibly, incredibly important. And being able to kind of accomplish trust in this and actually sort of move the industry forward. And so we've just always taken that approach from the beginning as a sort of like central tenet of that. So people can select what they share, select what elements within that, and select when and why they share it and with whom.
That's really good to know, because I'm sure a lot of people that think about wearable data, whenever you're signing up with an app these days, I consent to my whole life being taken by you and never getting back again, right? So it's nice that you have that level of control over what you're accepting and not accepting to. This area of research is really fascinating because just the ability to help individuals and help population at the same time is really fascinating. And I guess my big question is, where is this going? Like we've seen a rapid acceleration of digital technology, wearable technology, smartphones, as you said.
Yeah.
What's the end game, or is there an end game? Where do we see 2030, 2040? Where are we going to be? Where do you see the future going?
Yeah, I think for me, there's a couple pieces to this. One that I think is really interesting is sort of like what new sensors will we have access to on a longer time horizon that can give us different types of data. Certainly, we talked about temperature sensors, which can tell you about stress or female reproductive health, to blood glucose sensors that are, not just in the pure clinical diabetes context, but, even they're starting to be used consumer grade in some, limited cases now. I think O2 sat has been incorporated in a number of things, but is a great example of one where there's probably room to improve. It can be really powerful, but at the same time, probably needs to be tested on a more diverse population and people of color. Like it doesn't work as well, which highlights the need for diversity, equity, and that type of focus around these things. So I think that's one way to slice it, which is like the technology component and where is some of that going and how does that help push things forward? I think for me, if you look out to 2030, 2040, what gets really interesting and exciting is wearables are starting to be used in ways that are outside of just the wellness space, ways that are a little less obvious, like we talked about, digital biomarkers that can really start bridging some of the use of this into the healthcare system. So when I look into the future, what I hope is that we end up in a situation where the doctor calls you.
Very cool.
So, instead of, we talked about like having a checkup at random intervals, like what about a proactive check-in so you can take action? Because guess what? Something looks a little bit different and probably needs your attention. And I think this is really where you start seeing person-generated health data, or PGHD, intersecting with this notion of personalized medicine. And I think that's part of the bridge of how we get there in the future.
Super cool. And I love this concept of personalized health medicine, because when you look at genetics and other these things, that's where it's going.
Yeah.
I can see, that it's an interesting thing there. And it made me think of, in Canada, sometimes we have a shortage of family doctors, or family doctors have large rosters. If the physician had access to this data, you'd be able to pick and choose who do you need to see versus, you know what, you don't need to see me. Your biomarkers are okay. Is there a problem? No, then okay, let's check in again in 6 months digitally, as opposed to making an appointment and showing up to the office and waiting for an hour and, all of the things that go through. It may make the healthcare system more efficient and more targeted along this lines of personal medicine, sort of focusing on what does the individual need. But by focusing on the individual needs, you're almost helping the whole, by offloading the burden on the system in some cases. I'm very pie in the sky here right now, but you get the idea of how these things could be used in a positive way to help everybody. It's really cool.
Yeah. And I think you bring up an excellent point. Anywhere where there's shortage of skilled caregivers, difficulty in accessing physical care because of, long travel distances or anything like that, there's a really large opportunity for thinking about almost what you described as like in-place healthcare, or how to direct resources more efficiently. And I know there's really good example cases of that happening in rural medicine or, developing countries, where kind of this like access and sort of disaggregated data sets around healthcare can help you figure out how to direct resources, how to target interventions, when to reach out. And I think paired with things in the future like telemedicine access, these types of solutions can have a really big impact on scaling of healthcare as well, and access to healthcare.
Medcan, in previous years, we had a program called Nweza, and what we did was we linked with some sister clinics in rural Kenya. And so these clinics would have a population of people that lived near the clinics, but then there were these small villages that were further and remote. And this is going back really when smartphones weren't, this is 10 years or so, but we looked at SMS technology, text messaging technology, because cell phones, even in developing countries or countries that have less gross capital wealth, have cell phones. They're all over the place. And text was a relatively cheap and easy way to do it. And what we actually did to try to target these rural communities was we tried to engage a community leader, whether it was someone who's really well respected or an educator in the community, someone who was a leader within that small community. Yeah. And we actually engaged them and tried to get them on board with the idea of them having a cell phone, if they didn't already have one, on this, how we could use with certain health measures, taking blood pressure, heart rate, blood glucose levels. Then they were actually the ones sort of becoming a community health provider that were taking these testings, inputting the data through an SMS that would then go back to the health clinic, so that the next time that we could go and we could pre-select the people that really needed to be targeted and seen first, as opposed to having a whole lineup of people that were trying to access care. We were able to efficiently see the ones that were pre-tested, predetermined to need additional viewing. And that makes me think of, what you're describing is a far more technologically advanced way of doing it than just with simple text messaging.
Yeah, but even like you said, the simple text messaging can make a huge difference. Like, they don't always have to be these like super high tech technologies. I think some of these things deployed in really smart ways can make a big difference in, prioritizing resource access to care, remote care, a number of things there, which I think is really, really exciting.
Very cool. Because as you said, in developing countries where there's a large component of population that is underprivileged, they don't have access to Apple Watches, right? So, but we can use the data and the techniques to help more people and to bring, again, to reduce those barriers to access to care. And as we get more of these things, that costs come down a bit and styles come down. Like, it makes me think of the Oura ring as an example, which is just a ring that goes on a finger. Like, technology is getting really advanced and coming up with new things.
It's been a very exciting past few decades in this area, and I can only imagine the next few will have a lot more things to come.
From a company such as yours, it must be hard to keep up with the rate of change, right? With all these new technologies and new tests and sensors that are coming out, it must be hard to keep on top of all of that change.
It is, but we really try and partner in the ecosystem, understand what's coming. We have groups of folks looking at partnerships and keeping tabs on that, because it really matters in terms of being able to integrate that and speed the progress of research.
Very cool. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I myself, and within Medcan as a whole, I can't wait for your company and other companies like you to come into the market in Canada so that we can look at how we can use data such as this to help our patient base, because that's really what we try to do, is help people proactively from an Eat, Move, Think perspective, because those are the things that we do to really make sure that your health and well-being is better moving forward proactively as opposed to reactively. Leslie, now, based on all this great stuff that we've been talking about, I really need to know, does Evidation have any time frame or desire to come into Canada and other markets around the world?
Great question. So Evidation is already doing some research and has some upcoming research studies and large-scale programs planned for Canada. We don't have an exact date on when the Evidation app will be available in Canada, but we'll be sure to keep y'all posted.
Well, you better, or I'll be very upset.
Will do.
So I want to thank you very much for being here. It's really exciting to see where this data is going and some of the work that you and your company are doing. I want to thank you again for the wing things you're doing and Evidation. So thank you for being here.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. Stay well, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on our podcast.
That was Dr. Andrew Miners, Medcan's Clinical and Product Director of Sports Medicine, Therapy, Rehabilitation, and Fitness, in conversation with Leslie Wilberforce, the Chief Operating Officer of Evidation Health.
You can follow Evidation Health on Twitter at EVIDATION, and follow Medcan on Twitter and Instagram at MedcanLiveWell.
We'll post episode highlights and links you can visit on our website at eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
Say hello and send us a tip or a suggestion by emailing us at info@eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
Eat, Move, Think is produced by Ghost Bureau. Jasmine Ratch is managing producer. Social media and strategy support is from Chantal Gertin, Andrew Imex, and Emily Bozick. Executive producer is me, Chris Shulgin.
We'll be back soon with a new episode examining the latest in health and wellness.
This podcast is intended to provide general information about health and wellness only and is not designed or intended to constitute or be used as a substitute for medical advice, treatment, or diagnosis. You should always talk to your Medcan healthcare provider for individual medical advice, diagnosis, and treatment, including your specific health and wellness needs. This podcast is based on the information available at the time of preparation and is only accurate and current as of that date. Source information and recommendations are subject to change based on scientific evidence as it evolves over time. Medcan is not responsible for future changes or updates to the information and recommendations and assumes no obligation to update based on future developments. Reference to or mention of specific treatments or therapies does not constitute or imply a recommendation or endorsement. The links provided within the associated document are to assist the reader with the specific information highlighted. Any third-party links are not endorsed by Medcan.